Hi everybody, Amor Towles here. As I think many of you know, as a novelist, I like to mix it up. So while Rules of Civility describes a year in the life of a 25-year-old woman who's about to climb the socioeconomic ladder of New York in the 1930s, A Gentleman in Moscow spans 32 years, telling the life of a middle-aged man who has just lost all of his possessions and all of his social standing. Now, with my new novel, The Lincoln Highway, I am going to mix it up again, in that this story follows three 18-year-old boys and an 8-year-old boy as they make their way from Nebraska to New York City in 1954, and the whole story lasts only 10 days. Now, why do I do this? Why do I mix it up in this fashion? The primary reason is that by taking my storytelling from one place and time into another, it requires me, or even allows me, I guess, to retool almost every element of my craft. By making this shift, I have to retool the tone of my work, the language of my work, the style of my storytelling, the structure of my storytelling, and ultimately the poetics, so that when I tell this story, it is told in a way that is true to these characters in this place at this moment in time. Now, on the one hand, I like to think that in reading The Lincoln Highway, you will recognize it as a Towles tale. It will rhyme, as it were, with those other works, but you will have the pleasure of entering a whole new set of terrain with a new set of characters and a new set of themes to consider. Now, why 1954? I'm telling a story about three young men on this trip from Nebraska to New York City. It could have been, I guess, in any time in the century, as it were, in the last 100 years. Why 1954? In retrospect, I don't think I thought of this really when I started, but in retrospect, I think what I like about the moment of 1954 in American history is it was not for what was happening, it was for all that was about to happen. If you think about 1954, it's actually between the wars, as it were. The Korean War has just come to a conclusion, and the Vietnam War, which doesn't really get underway until the 1960s, is actually gearing up in the late 50s, where America is sending advisors, military advisors, to Vietnam. So 1954 is sort of in this brief moment as the Korean War comes to an end and the Vietnam War is just about to start creeping upward into the major cataclysm it becomes in the 1960s. If you think of the civil rights movement in America, it's as old as the Union itself. But 1954 was the year of the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, which in theory ended the concept of separate but equal, or the history of the 100-year history of segregation under Jim Crow. And from that moment, it launches the whole series of events that culminate in the 60s civil rights activity, whether it begins with Rosa Parks on the bus refusing to give up her seat, which leads to Martin Luther King's boycott, and followed by the lunch counter boycotts, by the Freedom Risers, ultimately by the March on Washington, and then, as I say, culminating in the mid-60s with the Civil Rights Act. But this is all to come after 1954. In 1954, the sexual revolution is about to begin. Playboy is being issued for the first time in the United States, which is kind of taking the notion of pornography and putting it on the living room table, a magazine that in theory you could have in a dentist office, or you could read politely on a train, you know, this sort of crazy new notion of the role of pornography in public life. The Kinsey report on female sexuality is just coming out. In a few years, the pill is going to be invented, which of course completely changes the landscape of sexual activity in America and throughout the world, where young couples can suddenly have sex without fear of getting pregnant, and suddenly their entire lives being changed in a moment. So again, all of this is about to come. Rock and roll, the first rock and roll song, is in 1954. And so the entire generation of rock and roll, not only the music, but the activity that surrounds it, and really the the possibility, and this obviously occurred in England as well as in the United States, of teenagers suddenly having an incredible cultural voice. In the entire history of humanity, teenagers had never had their own medium with which to communicate with each other broadly. Suddenly, rock and roll provides that for the first time in history, where teenagers and young 20s, people in their young 20s, are writing this music, performing this music, and they're writing about their experiences and performing it for their generation. And that's one of the reasons why rock and roll immediately gets tied into the anti-war activity, the anti-disestablishmentarianism, that follows, and all those activities that define the 1960s. So again, as I say, this is about to happen. So what I like about 1954 is that the things that define the 1960s, all that incredible cultural turbulence, is actually there. It's just beginning to percolate, and it is presumably under the surface. So that gives me a chance to tell a story in what is a little bit quieter moment, and yet all that activity is happening at the same time. Now, one other thing I'll tell you about the story is that if you haven't read it, you will find that it is told from 8 different perspectives, kind of moves over the course of the 10 days. You hear from the different characters in the tale. Now, when I originally designed the book, and I am an outliner, and you may remember this from hearing me talk about a Joe in Moscow, but once I have an idea, I will spend several years designing a book, thinking about all of its components, getting it to the point where I can really visualize the entire story in my mind. And then I will start to outline it in great detail. And that process takes at least a year, where ultimately I know every chapter, all the key events, the settings, the characters and their backgrounds. That's all laid out for me before I start writing chapter 1. Now, inevitably, once I dig in, things start to change. The outline starts to evolve. I make discoveries. I have changes in view of where the story should go. The story tells me more about where it should be headed instead of what I had originally thought. And in the case of the Lincoln Highway, the biggest example of this by far is that when I designed the story, it was going to be told from the perspectives of just 2 characters. Emmett, the young son of a farmer from Nebraska, and Duchess, who grew up in sort of a rougher set of circumstances in New York City as the child of a sort of actor con man, in essence. And it was going to go back and forth between these 2 characters as the 10 days unfolded. These 2 young men who have come to know each other through chance. And that's the way the story was going to be told. But once I got pretty deeply into the story, I found myself writing a particular section where I thought, you know what, this section really needs to be told from the perspective not of Duchess or of Emmett, but from the character Ulysses. And I wanted to tell a section from this suddenly from the perspective of a character named Pastor John. And that began to make me rethink the entire plan. And suddenly I thought, you know what, the character Sally deserves to be heard. The character Wooly deserves to be heard. Abernathy deserves to be heard, and Billy deserves to be heard. So the outline was retooled, and I actually went back to the beginning of the story, and in essence started again, revising and beginning to weave in these counter perspectives that ultimately I think give the story both its scope and its texture. And I don't know how you'll feel when you finish it, but for me, it's hard to imagine at this stage that I ever conceived of the story as being told by just the 2 voices, because it's the richness of the 8 different voices that ultimately makes the book, I think, interesting structurally, artistically, and satisfying as a reading experience. At least that's what I hope. In closing, I guess I'll just make a quick personal remark, which is that I've wanted to write fiction all my life. It's really my primary dream since the time I was a boy. I was in 1st grade when I really decided I wanted to be a writer. And I've written for much of my life, most of my life, written fiction for most of my life. But I didn't get around to submitting a novel for publication until my mid-40s, when that was 10 years ago this summer, when Rules of Civility came out. So in the second half of my life, as it were, I've had the extraordinary satisfaction and the luxury of being able to tell stories with the help of the publishing houses and the bookstores, and with people like you who've done it. So I owe you an expression of gratitude for helping, giving me the chance to have my dream come true. But finally, I'll just say that when you pick up the Lincoln Highway, if you pick up the Lincoln Highway, I hope you enjoy reading it as much as I enjoyed writing it. Thanks so much.